Good morning again. While she's out of the room, I just want to say to all of you, Amanda did an amazing job leading camp the last 2 weeks. This last week, she spent from Saturday until Friday afternoon at the camp, at an overnight camp, and she was the camp minister, meaning that of the 100 and some people that were there, she was the one in charge, and she helped plan things for the past year and execute it, and she did an amazing job and made you very proud. So when you see her, give her a pat on the back and tell her that you heard she did an amazing job at camp, because she really did. All right, so this parable that I read to you a few minutes back, this is a parable called, sometimes referred to as the parable of the persistent widow. Sometimes it's called the parable of the unjust judge. And I got to be honest with you, this is one of the parables that I thought, okay, so if Jesus starts out by saying, let me tell you how to pray, and then the example that's listed is someone, at least from the judge's perspective, like someone who is continuing to nag at him, and from her perspective, the judge is someone who is unjust and unfair. Part of me thinks, or has wondered throughout the years, Jesus, could you come up with a better metaphor for this? I mean, it just seems like you're wanting us, pray like this. Let me tell you about an unpleasant scenario. Like it didn't feel like quite the right thing. And I realized, as I have done more research on this text, and I have looked into this more, that I think I was interpreting this from the wrong place. I think I had come at this from a little bit of the wrong angle, and I want to explain to you today why I think that ultimately this parable is one about hope, it's about God's grace, and it's about God's sense of justice. And I intend to try to convince you of that today too. But this parable falls nicely into this sermon series because while we have been looking, yes, at parables for the past few weeks, these are parables that, at least in my estimation, are ones that are a little bit more unusual. They may not be as familiar to us as, say, the Good Samaritan or the Prodigal Son. And there's sometimes ones that are just appearing once in the Gospels as opposed to Matthew, Mark, and Luke repeating them among themselves. Or they're just a little bit harder to understand. Like, what exactly are you talking about here, Jesus? What is it that you want us to walk away from? Now, the past 2 weeks, we've looked at parables that Jesus was really going out and challenging the listeners. They weren't easy parables. I mean, they might have been easier to understand, but as far as following through with what he is teaching, they were very complicated or very challenging to do that. And last week, we even talked about how that parable maybe was better suited as sort of an in-house family conversation more than a parable that Jesus maybe intended for us to be talking about here today, although I think that there was still plenty that was applicable for us in our time. Well, today I want to dive back into this parable about the widow. So remember, we talked about widows in Jesus' time a few weeks back, I think around sometime in early May. And you may remember that I told you that widows were in a particularly unusual kind of predicament because they had a life where they were married to somebody, and in a very patriarchal society, the man that they were married to was responsible for a lot of their decision making and responsible for their finances and responsible for their safety and their security and so forth. And that's very much the cultural model that was in effect in Jesus' time. The problem is that if you were a woman whose husband died, and by the way, that happened quite a bit, especially because men would marry usually women that were so much younger than them. When that happened, it was the responsibility of the family, the remaining family, to care for that woman because she had virtually no legal rights of her own. The money that her husband may have left behind did not go to her, and it was very difficult for folks in that situation to find any kind of employment where they could sort of provide for themselves. So they were very much stuck in a spot where they were dependent on some of the social structures that were in place and the generosity of others and their own offspring to take them in and care for them. But in some cases, women didn't have children, or their children had died, or maybe their children were killed in battle, maybe they were living far away, but for whatever reason, there was no safety net in place for them. And it sounds like when Jesus tells this parable, like when he describes this woman and she's going to appeal to a judge, that's probably the understanding, the cultural understanding is that's the really difficult place that she finds herself in. And what limited rules or laws or customs there were around protecting her, she was at the mercy of those rules being enforced. The laws may have been there, but obviously they have to be carried out for them to work. And so now we turn our attention to the judge. Now this judge we don't know anything about other than that Jesus says this man neither feared God nor had respect for anyone. Now that's an interesting sort of turn of phrase. It doesn't sound like a turn of phrase for us, but there's some reason to believe that in Jesus' time that this phrase, neither feared God nor had respect for anyone, was something that was pinned on certain people as a way to describe them, obviously in a very unfavorable way. There was a Jewish scholar at the time of Jesus named Josephus, and some of you may be familiar with some of his writings. He was not very well known, actually, in Jesus' time, but when his writings were preserved and discovered years later, he goes on to describe some of the historical events that we find in the Bible as a secondary source to support some of the things that were made as claims about things that happened in the Bible. For example, the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. Josephus talks extensively about that. And he refers in the Old Testament to a corrupt king of Judah named Jehoiakim. And he says that the way that he describes this corrupt king was that he neither feared God nor had respect for anyone. So in other words, if that is something that was a common way to describe somebody who was a real scoundrel, how do you describe sort of somebody that Jesus is trying to sort of paint the picture of somebody that is going to be very unjust, very corrupt? You're going to use this common phrase. And he describes this judge as someone who neither feared God nor had respect for anyone. So the judge is only going to do the things that the judge is interested in doing, and the judge is only going to act in the judge's self-interest. And so that's the setup for this story. And this widow says, "Please grant me justice." And the judge ignores her. And she keeps coming back again and again and again. And she's like, I'm not getting what I'm looking for, but I'm going to persist in this. And the judge keeps ignoring her. And then he says, maybe I'll just give her what she wants so she leaves me alone. I want her out of my hair. I want to be left in peace. I want the constant nagging to stop. So I will just grant her what she's looking for. This is the parable that Jesus says, pray like that. So you got to ask yourself, is what we are called to do in this parable, is what Jesus is saying to us is be persistent to the point of annoyance, and maybe then we'll get God's attention, if for nothing else, to get us off God's back. Surely that can't be exactly what Jesus is asking us to do. And so he goes on to say something that's kind of unique. And it's this, there's this practice in Judaism in Jesus' time that it was actually kind of legal terminology. And it was called Kal Valhomer. And what that means is from light to heavy. And the idea was that if something was true in levity or in small amounts or small scale, then it must also be true in bigger scale. For example, we heard the parable of these servants who received a payment or a sum of money from the master, and he told them to do something to invest that money. Well, in the Kal Valhomer kind of way of thinking about things, the servants who took a small amount of money and then were trusted later on with larger amounts of money, that's that way of thinking. If they could be trusted with light, and it proved to be true, then certainly they could be trusted with heavy, and that proved to be true. I think a better example is one we find Jesus saying also later on. We find this in Luke's gospel. This is from the 12th chapter. This will be familiar to many of you. For life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? Do you hear that? From light to heavy? I mean, if God makes sure that the ravens are cared for, the light, then how much more in the heavy will God care for you? So do not be concerned. Do not worry about having enough, because God will provide. Because if God does this for the birds, then God will certainly do this for you. Consider the lilies of the field. They are clothed in their splendor. Consider how much more God will do this for you, right? It's this idea of if it's the one thing that's a lighter matter, then the heavier will be true. And so this is the way that Jesus is setting up this parable. And he is setting up these two extreme kind of people, one who is in desperate need of justice, having no rights or privileges and totally at the mercy of society around her. And then you have the one who is interested in having control and power but not really concerned about the plight of this woman. And they're pitted against each other. And Jesus says, listen, if this situation works out in this way, imagine how much more so God will hear you when you appeal for justice. God will hear those prayers, and God will respond. So to our ears, 21st century listeners, it sounds like a kind of a curious example or parable for us. But in Jesus' time, this makes sense. You are pointing out it's like the ravens to the humans, right? It's the widow and the unjust judge to, but what if we're not talking about somebody like in that predicament and with that kind of power structure, but instead you're talking about somebody who actually hungers to bring justice to his creation? How much more so will that be the case? And Jesus says, that's how you should pray. Pray with the conviction and the desire to see justice done like the widow does. And how much more will God be interested in responding to that? How beautiful will that be when God makes that possible? Now the parable takes on a different kind of understanding. Now it's the far-fetchedness or the extreme of it actually is the point. Maybe it's the perfect example to lift up in Jesus' way of instructing us to pray. Because now we have heard if it can be true and justice can be done at one end of the spectrum, then surely on the more loving, grace-filled, and just end of the spectrum, it will be that way every single time. But when I hear this text, I also think that there's something else in this for us too. Because I think that sometimes what we tend to do, especially those of us who are regular in our prayer life, sometimes it almost feels like we do too much of the trusting God will take care of it and not enough of the persistence in what we want to do to see that come to fruition. In other words, have you ever felt like maybe you prayed for something and then you felt like you checked that box and you were then able to sort of wash your hands over about thinking about it and you could walk away? You ever felt that way? I mean, I feel that way certainly about situations that feel like well beyond my pay grade and something that I am capable of doing anything about, right? Well, I'll just pray for it and then I can sort of walk away feeling like I've done my part. But I think that the other part of what the widow talks about, or what the widow is doing in this story, is that she remains persistent, right? She is doing the thing that she can do. She is doing the only thing left in her toolbox that can help her feel like she is receiving the thing that she is asking for. She keeps going to the house of the judge. She keeps asking for justice to be done. She goes over and over and over again. And that's the dual part of prayer for us, is the part where we ask God, but we also do everything in our power to make that thing come to fruition that we can do too. So it's a two-way thing, isn't it? It's not just I'm going to do all that I can. I'm going to do all that I can, and I'm going to pray for God's intervention in this, or God's work for justice to be done. And when we pray for these things and we pour into it with ourselves, I think that that's where we see the biggest changes. Sometimes it's immediately in the things that we want to see rectified or justice to be done, and sometimes that is in the form of the change that occurs in our own hearts and allows us to have a different perspective or come to a sense of peace about it, or to continue to fight another day to work for that justice. So you may have noticed in this video that we showed just a moment ago with the kids at camp, there was a bridge that they crossed over. The bridge was the working metaphor for the whole week. And it was about building bridges. And they talked about how we build bridges with our neighbor. We build bridges in terms of opportunities to serve those in need. We build a bridge to God when we worship, and Jesus is the bridge that extends the kingdom to us. And I went up to the camp on Thursday night. Like, I wasn't there the whole week. Two members of my family were, and Amanda was there, and several kids from the church. But when I went up for Thursday, I was there for the closing worship service, because that's the final night before the kids go home on Friday afternoon. And I was there to preside at the communion table, which, as it was, on the surface of the bridge that they had built. And as you know, there's been a chasm that has been growing in our society. This is not news to anybody. But this was just one of those weeks that it felt particularly deep, and the rift was growing wider. You all know what's been going on. And here we were watching our elementary school kids come to worship, to begin their worship service by washing each other's feet. Yes, elementary school children washed each other's feet before they knelt before the bridge that connects us to our neighbor and us to God, and celebrated Holy Communion. And it was a reminder that that persistence in prayer and work for justice is possible. And what we know is that our political leaders and our government and our community organizations and even the church doesn't seem capable of building that bridge as it should be. But I saw children do it this week. And I saw them in their persistence and in their prayers and in their foot washing and in their breaking of the bread and then their crossing the bridge make that a reality. And so we talk about the kingdom of heaven, and we talk about having a little foretaste, as Jesus mentioned, or we see glimpses here and there. We see the kingdom realized already, but not yet altogether. And there was a snapshot, there was a fleeting moment of kingdom moment that I got to witness this week, and it happened at all places. Out in Gallant, Alabama, at a camp on a cement floor with children washing each other's feet. And as I came home and I saw the rift continue to open up yesterday and heard of the political assassination of legislators in my home state, and my heart hurts for this. And a parable that was chosen a month and a half ago to preach on today all of a sudden took on new meaning, and this thirst for justice that we want to have, this bridge and this mending that needs to happen, and the work that we have to do, which is not just to pray for it to happen and to pray for a miracle, but honestly we have to do our part in becoming a part of that prayer, to make that prayer a reality, to build that bridge, to mend this divide. And I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but we can't just sit on our hands and pretend it's going to happen on its own. Something needs to be done by all of us. Otherwise, the chasm continues to grow. And if we all fall into it, I want to go down fighting. Right? I want to be a part of trying to build that bridge. I want to be a justice worker. I want to be the persistent widow, using everything, limited as it is, at my disposal to be a part of that. And I know that you hunger and desire for that as well. So I'm going to close with a prayer this morning that is not my own, but it is a prayer of a United Methodist bishop who shared these words yesterday, Bishop Plembeck. She's just one of these people that I wish I could write like she does. Her prayers sound like poetry, and they're also so sincere. So if you would, I invite you to bow your head as I share this prayer